everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. Before I start anything today, I want to share with you where I'm coming from in this very moment. I am still enraged by something that happened about an hour ago, and I can't shake the feeling. My heart is sinking, I almost feel sick to my stomach. And nothing that major, but I was sitting in a kebab shop, in like a Turkish kebab shop, having a very disappointing falafel sandwich because, God, don't get me started on Turkish kebab and their inability to cook our cuisine well. But anyway, there was this American couple next to us who were talking utter bullshit about Israel, about Palestine, about Zionism. I don't think they used the word Palestine, because to them Palestinians don't exist. They were only talking about Muslims and Jews. And it got me so fucking angry, and I really should have said something, but one of those situations where they were talking and it was difficult for me to latch on to anything in specific, because they were talking kind of quietly, but also fucking American, so like it's loud as fuck, but it was kind of like this. It would go, the 60s, the West Bank, peaceful. I said, you know what I mean? Like, I can tell it is bullshit imperialist Zionist narratives and understandings of this history. But at the same time, I mean, there was a very specific moment at the very beginning where she said she had just come from Israel and was saying something about Dome on the Rock or some bullshit. And so, I don't know, just sitting there listening to this, it just really reminded me genuinely why I can't leave the house. It is so hostile. I find this type of language so violent and so present, and embodied within it is a complete erasure of us, of Palestinians, of the violence that Zionism, of imperialism, of the continued domination of our region. And it's just like, he ended the conversation by talking about the 1948 UN partition plan. You know, he was kind of talking about it as like a peace proposal, which is completely fucking bullshit. But yeah, he just says, yeah, it's interesting stuff. And it just fucking gets me so angry that this topic of amusement, of analysis, of this distant conflict to be discussing over shitty kebab. And I'm sitting here and like, this is my life. This is my people. This is my region. This is like the stakes for me. It's not just a matter of conversation. It's a matter of fucking life or death. I don't know. It's gotten me so angry and I haven't been able to shake it off. The banality of it all. The kind of, we talk about this, then like, yeah, we change topics to like, oh, this is a pretty good falafel, isn't it? Fucking Americans. Anyway, that has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about in today's episode. But I just wanted to share that with you because I needed to say it. Because it's in my body at the moment and I can't shake it off. And it's definitely going to inform how I'm talking and kind of my body at the moment. And I just wanted to share that with you. Anyway, the main topic of today's episode is going to be about Tankies. I feel like if people have come to this podcast through From the Periphery or through the Fire These Times, you'll be well familiar with Tankies, Tankyism, and how problematic and destructive and harmful it is, and how wrong it is, and just kind of imaginary. But I still want to talk about it, and I've kind of bit my tongue for the last few months. I've been talking here or there, but it definitely needs to be said. And especially now, a comrade of ours who's like affiliated with From the Periphery is part of a group who created a new Instagram page with only one post at the moment, and the page is called People Not States. I highly recommend checking it out. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes. Check it out, read all the slides, look at the comments. Because there's nothing like saying we are against all genocides, like having voices from different marginalized communities around the globe, communities that have experienced or are still continuously experiencing genocide, to come up to say these things, to expose and bring out the Tankies. So the comments are all, this is so Fed, this is CIA, this is bullshit, this is harmful to the Palestinian cause. And by and large, these are white guys saying it. By and large, they say this stuff and then they say, I highly recommend checking out grayzone.com or following Max Blumenthal. And it becomes very apparent once you spend enough time examining these people that it actually is quite niche. There are actually only a few key figures and key outlets that propagate these narratives and these ideologies. And I personally find them incredibly fucking delusional and harmful and damaging to any of the movements that people in our region have been forming in resistance to authoritarianism, to colonialism, to whatever. And I think it's about time that we collectively, call this out. Because the main claim for Peoples Not States is that we should normalize calling out genocide denial wherever it comes from. Because at the moment, and it is very difficult to say this, there is the most intense, visible, excruciatingly horrendous genocide happening to Palestinians in Gaza. There's also genocide happening in Darfur. There was also genocide in the Tigray region. There's also genocide that happened and is still kind of perpetually being kept up in Syria by the Assad regime and by Iran and by Hezbollah and also by Russia, most importantly almost. But also in the Xinjiang region. There's another name for it, I keep forgetting it, and I apologize for not saying this, but there are numerous genocide situations happening concurrently around the world. And I see this as a kind of collapse of the neoliberal nation-state order, and this kind of folding in, and this kind of, as the kind of hegemony collapses, and as neoliberalism continues to kind of deplete resources. There are a lot of reasons, but I do think there are some sort of meta reasons that are allowing and enabling all these genocides. And chief amongst them is how we're seeing so many of the international organizations unable to prevent the most obvious one that is happening right now. And the opposite, it is also being cheered on by some of the largest economies and the largest militaries. And so it's deeply fucked. But anyway, I'm already getting ahead of myself, as I tend to do, but I am going to talk a little bit in this episode about Tankies as they apply to our region, as in the Swana region, but also as it relates to understandings of imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. Because I see a lot of their critiques of us. And us, I mean here, people who understand imperialism as something that is not just a Western thing, is not just something that comes from the US, that there are multiple imperialisms happening concurrently, that there are competing forces that ultimately, many of us find ourselves in between and without really an ally. And so between the US and Russia, it's not, I hate the US, so I guess Russia is good. No, fuck that. Because they're still bombing us. Because there's still an imperialist power. Because there's still an authoritarian, capitalist, fucking neo-monarchy almost. So fuck it. I'm not here for this game of a chessboard where basically I raise myself and my community. Anyway, so again, jumping ahead of myself. Before I get into all that, just a brief announcement. I am still doing the sub-series Keep This Between Us, and it's been great. I'm really appreciating having a space to sort of talk about stuff that isn't fucking war and genocide and white supremacist imperialists, and just doing storytelling, which is a thing I think I enjoy doing the most. So if you want to listen to this new sub-series, you can do so in two ways. Become a member of our Patreon and get a lot of other extra, benefits, like joining our monthly hangout and getting access to all the other podcasts. Or if you're listening to this podcast on Apple Podcast, you can subscribe through Apple Podcast. It's like 1 or 2 buttons, $5 a month. You get access to all the podcasts, and you get my sub-series and a lot of exclusive content that we're increasingly doing more and more. We obviously want to keep all the podcasts in this channel ad-free, And so we're relying on your support, and we want to make it worth your while. So we're making more and more exclusive content for those who become members of our Patreon or Apple Podcast subscription. And so, yeah, that's my only announcement for this episode. So before I get into the main topic, another reason that I was so pissed off, and I am still pissed off at the kind of bullshit American detached Zionism that I was hearing at the kebab place, is that today there were 2 major massacres in Gaza, and it's just not fucking stopping. It's just horrendous. The Israelis have created the world's largest kill zone. I completely agree with people when they describe Gaza not as a concentration camp, but as like a killing field, as an open air graveyard where everyone is already deemed dead or not yet dead. It's so fucked up, and it makes hearing that kind of conversation so fucking frustrating, but also to see the lack of movement. There is definitely, I recorded an episode a week ago, and I was talking about this feeling that there's less energy. And for me, I'm still constantly seeing these videos by Palestinians who are embedding their videos within like clickbaity videos. You know, you find yourself watching someone slipping on a rock. Before they hit their back on the rock, poof, it's a woman in Gaza saying, please don't skip this video. And I'm seeing it more and more. And so obviously they're feeling that lack of energy, that lack of engagement. And it breaks my fucking heart. And I really don't know what to do. I am so fucking besides myself. And I was expecting a summer of rage, you know, after the build-up. But it seems people are on their fucking vacation. It seems people are just giving up. Or are just kind of, I don't know. I have to be a little bit optimistic and hope that there's something happening that we're not seeing. That a lot of this action that used to be very kind of public is now a bit behind closed doors, or at least a bit underground. But I don't know. And I'm really, really hoping that it wasn't just a fad, that white kids were out there yelling Palestine because it was cool for a semester. Or, I don't know. Something really needs to break. And being here in Europe and seeing all these tourists and seeing all these people going about their day, eating a kebab, talking about whatever, the peace process as though it was an actual thing, infuriates me. And just so contributes to this feeling of alienation that I've been experiencing for the last, I don't know, few years. But yeah, I've got nothing to say. I'm really hitting that wall that I think a lot of us are, where it's like, I am going to continue doing what I was already doing, knowing that I need to be doing more, but I'm not going to let these kind of forces of stagnation, of kind of pulling back, affect me. You know, it's very easy to go with the flow, to see a lot of people not doing anything and like, oh, okay, it's normal now. Most people seem to be okay with the daily massacres and just kind of, well, what can you do about it? No, I need to constantly resist that, and I think everybody needs to. Otherwise, it's all fucking doomed. So there's that. Now, the main thing I want to talk about today is Tankiism. I've been reading lately some texts by sort of neo-post-colonial thinker Aimé Césaire. I've never read him. I've always heard like quotes of him or seen like some references to his work. For those, if I didn't say it correctly, it kind of looks like Aimé Césaire. He was a francophone poet and writer and politician from Martinique, which is like a French colony, I think in the Caribbeans. And yeah, he has this essay called Discourse on Colonialism, and it's just so fucking powerful. I haven't read anything like that in a very long time, where as I'm reading it, it almost feels like I shouldn't be reading this, you know? It felt wrong, but it was so powerful, it was so direct, and there's so much humor even, which I did not expect, but it's just very fascinating, and something I'm really focusing on about the colonial mentality, the kind of pervasive colonial mentality. Anyway, why do I bring him up in this context? Well, he was a Trotskyist. He was a communist. He was, supported the USSR and kind of saw it as a model for liberation, for, equality, and especially for like a post-racial kind of reality, blah, blah, blah. But he broke with the USSR in 1956 sort of like after the Soviet Union's crushing of the Hungarian Revolution, the Communist Revolution. But essentially, it's a communist revolution that was against, authoritarian communist leaders, and which were very allied to the Stalinist USSR at the time. And so, the USSR went in with its tanks and they crushed the revolution. And again, this was a communist revolution, but it wasn't their revolution, as in it wasn't aligned to the USSR. And so they crushed it with tanks. And this is where the term tankie comes from. Tankies are essentially authoritarian leftists. And I use the word leftist here. I know a lot of people, when they talk about tankies, use quotation marks because they're not actually leftists. But I've also had these conversations where it's like, no, we should not put those quotation marks because this is the state of the left in many ways. And especially traditionally, the people who still think that it's the 20th century, that the Soviet Union is going to come back any moment. Like, there are a lot of them, and especially in the West. I remember when I lived in London, my God, like one of the biggest newspapers in circulation on the left, like the Daily Worker or whatever it was called, super fucking tanky. And basically this is how it would go. The front page would be some takedown of the Tory government, focusing on labor issues, focusing on bourgeois domination, whatever. Good shit, right? And then you flip the page to page 8 into the international section. And I remember so clearly, I think the dude's name was Todd Sweeney. And it was just tanky fucking propaganda. And so it's that duality of like pro-worker, pro-proletariat, pro-whatever, anti-capitalist. But then, actually, my favorite, I used to buy this. I actually used to steal it a lot because I didn't want to give the money, but I did always want to keep an eye on them. Was on the front page, it said refugees welcome. And it had this big picture of this like family on the shores of Britain. And it was an article about, like we should welcome them and we should treat them whatever as our own. Good shit, right? Go to page 8, international section, Todd Sweeney, talking about the Assad regime liberating areas, talking about terrorists in Idlib, completely erasing the revolution, completely erasing the counter-revolutionary violence of the Assad regime, of the Russian state, of Iran. There's none of it. I, even in my naivety, sent an email to Todd Sweeney, and he gave me the same condescending bullshit that I've always received, that you will always receive by these leftists, You could literally be like the person in the photo on the cover of this magazine, of this newspaper, and send in an email and say, this does not represent me. They will ignore you because they will say that you are propagandized, you are colonized, you are buying into Zio-Wahhabi propaganda, whatever. And there are a lot of them. Again, like I said at the outset, it's actually quite a specific bunch, and I will be naming some of them. And I do so not wanting to create this kind of discord of it's either us or them. I actually think a lot of people listening to this might be unknowingly reading these outlets. And in some cases, they do produce decent, good stuff on Palestine, on certain struggles around the globe that honestly mainstream media does ignore and is complicit within, essentially Western imperialist narratives that kind of ignore anything that's happening in the Congo, for instance. But oftentimes you will see the same erasures, the same violent language that clearly aligns itself with tankyism, which again, I should state, from the perspective of a kind of global politics, they only recognize American imperialism. They only see that as the central bad in the world. And I think it's one of the worst things there is. It is one of the main factors of violence and oppression around the globe. But it is not the only imperialism. It is not the only violent thing. It is not the only thing that communities around the world struggle against. There are local power structures. There are local patriarchies and capitalist forces and neo-colonial forces that have different faces. And so I remember being really confronted with this in 2019 during our revolution, which was against the sectarian oligarchy of, all of them. The literal phrase that sort of kicked off the revolution was all of them means all of them. But that didn't stop these Tankies from jumping on and being like, they'd call it a color revolution, and it's a CIA propped up thing to counteract Hezbollah's, presence, because Hezbollah is so popular, and this is just a CIA Zio plot to overthrow one of the main pillars of the axis of resistance. There's literally, you could do a chat GPT, like Tanky GPT, and it's the same article, and talk about Iran, talk about Syria, talk about Yemen, talk about anything, and it is the same fucking script that essentially erases the actual people, the actual communities, And it is so fucking frustrating. And they have done tremendous amounts of harm, and I really don't think that we should be considering them, allies in the struggle. And it gets very difficult because obviously there are a lot of Arabs that subscribe to this. I will bring this up in a little bit. There's a sort of different formulation of Tankies in the Arab world, which is very difficult to shake off because that is actually quite predominant. But for Tankies, and here I mean specifically in the West, they do see our region as a kind of chessboard, and they see the US as this bad. And so anything that kind of even claims to resist it is seen as good. And so the main example of this is their veneration of Bashar al-Assad, who, we hate. And I don't mean we as in every single person in the region, because I do know that obviously there are a lot of even Syrians who are for him or whatever. But again, it's not a chessboard. It's not, I'm with Liverpool, you're with Chelsea. The man is responsible for genocide. The man has destroyed Syria. The regime he is a part of, ever since his father took over in the 60s, is an oppressive, violent, authoritarian, petit bourgeois regime. In this very famous interview that Hassan Kanafani gives, that a lot of these Tankies are sharing, they conveniently leave out the fact that he calls the Assad regime a petit bourgeois military regime. And thinking in terms of dignity, of our ability as a region to sustain life, to whatever, Assad is not it at all. So it's so bizarre for me for them to be saying, he is actually good because he is anti-US. And a second thing is, how is he anti-US? How is he even anti-Israel? What has he done? This is the second part of the whole Tanky ideology that is so frustrating. Not only are they talking over us, and essentially in this case replicating the kind of white supremacist erasure of our voices and our struggles, because they know better, than we do about our region. But it's also imaginary. It's based on complete fabrications. When they talk about, and I mean here, this is Richard Medhurst. Richard Medhurst is one notorious Tanky who says that if it weren't for Syria or Iran, there would not be a Palestinian resistance, which is completely bullshit for many reasons. One of which is that the Syrian regime literally, not just in Yarmouk, murdered and cleansed thousands of Palestinians who lived in Syria. But the regime has always been opposed to Palestinian resistance and has always monopolized it. And so here, literally in 1976, you have, or 75, the Syrian regime invading Lebanon to attack the PLO. It honestly gets me so frustrated, and there are a lot of moving pieces, which is why it's a bit difficult. I hope I'm not losing any of you. But ultimately, they're not serious. When you actually look at them, when you actually look at their analysis, it is not serious. And it is not principled. It is not based on actual ideas of human dignity, of freedom, of liberation. One big page, actually, which isn't as notorious, it's called Warfare Analysis, Again, I will say, if you see geopolitics in someone's bio, massive red flag. Because they'll have information, they'll show videos, they'll retweet stuff that's like pretty decent. But then they'll come out with a little piece of analysis where they write something like, and this is literally me quoting, if Iran liberates Palestine, it should get to rule it. What kind of twisted ideology is this? This is not anti-imperialism. This is purely only anti-American imperialism, because it is literally championing and advocating for Iranian imperialism, which does exist and has had catastrophic effects on the region over the last 50 fucking years. 45, let's say. And just look what they've done in Iraq. Look what they've done in Syria. Look what they've done in Palestine. Like what? They send some weapons, they get some arms, but it is not this force that in the imaginary of the Tankie, it is. It is not. It is not this liberatory force. It is its own imperialist power with its own calculations and its own, power structure which replicates itself and has certain narratives that, yeah, it's bullshit. What have the Iranians done for Palestine in the last 10 months of genocide? I don't know. It gets me really fucking frustrated because I can't believe we still have to say this. And I do believe that these people are in the minority. I mean, for the most part, Palestinians fucking hate Bashar al-Assad, Any Palestinian I've ever spoken to, and a lot of the Palestinians I know are literally like Palestinian Syrians, are very aware, And most Arabs have seen what Bashar al-Assad has done to Syria and has done to Syrians and the state Syrians are in. And, this isn't a guy who's going to liberate Jerusalem tomorrow. This is a guy who's not even the biggest player in his own fucking country. This is a guy who's literally sold, his father sold the Golan to the Israelis, and now he has sold the entire country to the Iranians and the Russians. And something that really is not spoken about, but the kind of quasi-settler colonialism of Iran in Syria, there are huge waves of migration, essentially of like Iranian and Afghani Shia populations in Syria, places that are cleansed of their Sunni Arab populations who are now in refuge in Turkey and Lebanon and Europe. And now there are different communities that are intentionally being placed in their, taken over and taking whatever. It's so fucked up. And it's very hard to talk about this now because it feels like, yeah, you're distracting from what's happening in Palestine because it's X versus Y and we're all against Y. So if you talk anything about X, then you must support Y. And it's like, no. And again, you look at a lot of the comments in this thing that I talked about earlier, which again, highly recommend, check it out, People Not States. And yeah, a lot of the comments are like, oh, you talk about this, why don't you talk about the UAE or Saudi? Fuck the Saudis, fuck UAE, like what are you talking about? Like if you actually listen, they've got nothing on us. They just, within their mindset, can only see an us or them mentality. And it is not just us and them. Like there is so much more going on. And between the us and them and their imaginary, we, as in people in the region who neither support these authoritarian regimes and absolutely are completely opposed to Zionism, to American imperialism and American capitalism and Western domination of the region, essentially. But also, it isn't us and them. It is not that concrete. Not just because of the inclusion of people like me and so many others, but there is this kind of false narrative that is just bullshit. It just does not exist. It only exists in their imagination. And they take up so much space. And here again, I am talking about the gray zone. I am talking about the cradle. I know a lot of people are posting the cradle and Mint Press and stuff like Redstream. Like, it's very fucking cynical because the stuff they do in Palestine is very good. And I'm not blaming anybody for posting them and not knowing, and especially if it's a video they created. But there's a lot in the background. If you go onto their pages, you type in Syria, you type in China, you type in Russia, and see the analysis, see the background, see the violence of what they're actually advocating for and their analysis. And it is so fucked. And it is so detrimental. And it needs to be opposed. And I say this as a Lebanese. I say this as a leftist. I say this as an internationalist. who knows we in the region desperately need a serious internationalist left that does not yet exist. And those that claim to be internationalists, who in the West talk about Africa, talk about the Middle East, talk about Zionism and all these things, they are not our allies. They are cosplaying as internationalists, but they are just another face of a kind of white supremacist imperialist logic that essentially dominates the region epistemologically. I don't like using jargon, I'm sorry, but as in they kind of create their own knowledge that still erases us and our experience, and the kind of gray zone that we exist in. I think we should reclaim that. The gray zone as a magazine, as an outlet, is a disgusting, one of the worst. It's horrible. And what it does is essentially claim to be the gray zone. And no, they are not at all. They are clearly one of the black and white. They're clearly within the binary. Fuck it. Anyway, this was my whole rant about Tankies. And yeah, I hope that was kind of thorough. I kind of lose myself when I'm still obviously very upset at what happened a couple of hours ago. But a lot of these people are genocide deniers, right? And I have a kind of basic principle, which is I don't want to hear anything a genocide denier has to say about another genocide. Your Roger Waters or your Max Blumenthal's. Like, these people are irrelevant to me, and their opinions about Palestine is irrelevant to me. They do not matter. And they only matter because of this bullshit kind of climate, social media clout. They've got big followers. Roger Waters has his Pink Floyd stuff. But, did good music, fucking genocide denier, conspiracy theorist, piece of shit. I hope he dies. And anyway, yeah, I'm sick of it, and I'm not holding back anymore. And I'm going to call out genocide denial when I see it. And especially in a time of heightened genocide, I don't think it detracts. I think it reinforces our understanding of these situations, how to combat them, how to even understand them, and how to see, who's around us and who should we ally ourselves with, who should we ignore, who should we call out. Because, yeah, it's been at least a couple of decades of this bullshit, but much more so since 2015, and something really needs to fucking change. I don't know how that is, but I definitely know that's not it. And I think that's it. Highly recommend you check out this new page, People Not States, which I'll leave the link in the comment section below. And yeah, I guess that's it for me today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope I didn't meander too much. If you appreciate this podcast, you can support it in a number of ways. You can become a member of our Patreon. You can become a subscriber through Apple Podcast. You can leave a tip in the tip jar below. Or if you're not able to do any financial stuff, leave a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast and tell your friends about it. It's free and it really helps us grow. So yeah, I guess that's it. I guess I'll see you all next time.